Why they shut down California's deadliest prison. A Life Behind Bars documentary. For decades, it stood as one of the most feared correctional institutions in America. A prison built for violence. A prison defined by gangs. A prison that even veteran officers approached with caution. And then, after nearly a century, California made a decision that would have been unthinkable at its peak. They shut it down. Not because crime disappeared. Not because it became safe. But because the system around it changed. Tonight, on Life Behind Bars, we examine the fully documented, verifiable reasons behind the closure of one of California's most notorious and deadly prisons, the California State Prison at Corcoran. Before we begin, if you value deeply researched, factual crime and prison documentaries, like this video and subscribe to Life Behind Bars. Your support helps us continue producing accurate, long-form investigations into the realities of the prison system. Now let's go back to where it began. A prison built for control. California State Prison, Corcoran opened in 1988 in Kings County, California. It was built during one of the most aggressive prison expansion eras in American history. Between the 1980s and early 2000s, California dramatically increased incarceration rates due to mandatory sentencing laws, gang crackdowns, and later the three strikes legislation. Prison populations surged far beyond what older facilities could contain. Corcoran was part of that expansion. It was designed not simply as another prison, but as a high-security institution capable of housing some of the state's most violent inmates. Within its walls was a security housing unit, known as the SHU, built for long-term solitary confinement. Inmates identified as gang leaders or high-risk threats were housed there for years, sometimes decades. From the beginning, Corcoran had a reputation for control through isolation. But over time, it would become known for something far darker: violence in the yards. In the 1990s, Corcoran became nationally known for a series of violent incidents in its exercise yards. Official investigations later confirmed that correctional officers had, at times, placed rival gang members together in enclosed yards, settings where violence was highly likely. When fights broke out, officers stationed in elevated gun towers fired live ammunition to stop the altercations. According to federal investigations and court findings from the mid-1990s, multiple inmates were shot and killed during these incidents. The U.S. Department of Justice launched a civil rights investigation into the prison's practices. Federal prosecutors alleged that some officers staged or allowed fights to occur. Several correctional officers were charged in connection with civil rights violations. Some were later acquitted. Others faced administrative discipline. It is important to note, while misconduct was documented, not every officer was implicated. The facility employed hundreds of staff members over its history. But the investigations permanently altered Corcoran's national reputation. It was no longer simply a maximum security prison. It was now publicly associated with lethal force and institutional controversy. The SHU and long-term isolation. The security housing unit at Corcoran was part of a broader strategy used across California's prison system. Inmates identified as gang affiliates were placed in solitary confinement, sometimes indefinitely unless they debriefed, meaning they provided information about gang activities. This practice became the subject of major legal challenges. Advocates argued that prolonged isolation caused severe psychological harm. State officials maintained that segregation was necessary to control organized prison gangs. The debate intensified over the years. In 2011 and again in 2013, inmates across California, including those at Corcoran, participated in hunger strikes protesting long-term solitary confinement conditions. The strikes drew national media attention. Eventually, a major class-action lawsuit challenged California's use of indefinite solitary confinement. In 2015, the state reached a settlement agreement that significantly reformed how gang validation and SHU placement worked. Thousands of inmates were reviewed and many were transferred out of long-term isolation units. This legal shift marked a turning point. The system Corcoran had been built to operate, long-term isolation of gang leadership, was fundamentally changing. Overcrowding and federal oversight. By the early 2000s, California's prison population had ballooned to nearly double its designed capacity. Corcoran, like many facilities, operated under strain. In 2009, a federal three-judge panel ruled in a landmark decision that California's overcrowded prison system violated the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment due to inadequate medical and mental health care. The ruling required the state to reduce its prison population dramatically. This led to realignment policies in 2011, shifting many lower-level offenders to county jails rather than state prisons. Over time, the state prison population began to decline. Facilities that had once been bursting beyond capacity were now operating with empty housing units. The logic of maintaining every high-cost maximum security institution began to shift. Corcoran, with its controversial history, aging infrastructure, and reduced need for large-scale SHU housing, was no longer untouchable. The financial reality. Operating a maximum security prison is extraordinarily expensive. Staffing costs, security infrastructure, medical services, utilities, and maintenance all carry significant financial weight. As the prison population declined, California officials began evaluating which facilities were most cost-effective to maintain. Some prisons were newer and more efficient. Others, like Corcoran, required ongoing maintenance and had structural limitations. State budget documents and legislative discussions increasingly focused on consolidation. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, California announced plans to close multiple state prisons as part of long-term population decline projections. In 2023, California confirmed that the original Corcoran facility would close. Inmates were transferred to other institutions. Staff were reassigned within the correctional system. It marked the end of an era. Not because it was peaceful. Not because it was forgotten. But because the system that created it had changed. Was it really the deadliest? The label Deadliest Prison has often been used in media descriptions of Corcoran, particularly during the 1990s following the yard shooting investigations. However, it is important to clarify, there is no official designation ranking California prisons by lethality. The term reflects the documented number of fatal shootings and the severity of federal investigations during that era. While violence occurred in multiple high-security prisons across the United States, Corcoran's combination of confirmed fatal shootings, federal prosecution of staff, and SHU controversy gave it a uniquely severe reputation. Reputation, however, is not the same as statistical ranking. What is documented is this. Multiple inmates died from gunshot wounds fired by correctional officers during yard incidents in the 1990s. Federal authorities investigated. Policy changes followed. And decades later, the prison itself was shut down. The broader shift Corcoran's closure reflects something larger than a single institution. California's prison population has declined significantly from its peak in the mid-2000s. Legal reforms, sentencing changes, parole adjustments, and voter-approved initiatives have all reshaped incarceration in the state. This does not mean violence inside prisons has disappeared. It does not mean the system no longer faces criticism. But it does mean that the era of rapid prison expansion, the era that built Corcoran, has ended. The question now is different. What happens to a prison designed for maximum control when the system that required that control no longer exists in the same form? That answer is still unfolding. Federal investigations and the yard shootings. In the mid-1990s, California State Prison Corcoran became the subject of one of the most serious federal civil rights investigations ever directed at a state correctional facility. The investigation centered on a pattern of shootings that had taken place inside the prison's security housing unit exercise yards. According to findings from the U.S. Department of Justice, correctional officers stationed in gun towers shot multiple inmates during fights in enclosed yards. Official records confirmed that several inmates died from gunshot wounds inflicted by staff. Federal investigators alleged that in some cases, rival gang members were intentionally placed together in small exercise yards where violence was highly likely. It is important to state clearly, the allegation was not that all yard placements were staged, nor that all shootings were unlawful. The investigation focused on whether certain officers deliberately created situations that led to lethal force. Some officers were charged in federal court with civil rights violations. Prosecutors argued that the use of deadly force in certain incidents was not justified under constitutional standards. However, criminal cases are governed by strict burdens of proof. Several officers were acquitted at trial. Others had charges dismissed. Administrative discipline and internal reviews followed in some instances. The outcome of the prosecutions demonstrated the complexity of proving intent in correctional settings. It also highlighted the difficulty of distinguishing between legitimate security measures and alleged misconduct. What is fully documented is this. Multiple inmates were killed during yard incidents in the 1990s. The Department of Justice conducted a civil rights investigation. Federal charges were filed. The cases received national media coverage. And Corcoran's reputation changed permanently. The legal standard for deadly force. Correctional officers are legally permitted to use force under specific circumstances. Deadly force is constitutionally governed by standards derived from Supreme Court precedent concerning excessive force and the Eighth Amendment. The legal question in prison use of force cases is not simply whether force occurred. It is whether the force was applied maliciously and sadistically for the very purpose of causing harm, or in a good faith effort to maintain or restore discipline. In the Corcoran cases, prosecutors attempted to argue that some shootings crossed that constitutional line. Defense attorneys argued that officers responded to violent fights between inmates and acted to prevent further injury or death. Juries ultimately weighed those arguments. The mixed legal outcomes did not erase the controversy. Instead, they triggered policy reforms. After the investigations, the California Department of Corrections revised certain yard management practices and use of force reporting procedures. External oversight increased, and the federal spotlight remained on the institution for years. The Security Housing Unit, a system under pressure. Corcoran's Security Housing Unit was part of a broader strategy used throughout California to manage prison gangs. Inmates validated as gang members or associates could be assigned to indefinite solitary confinement. Cells were typically small, concrete, and designed for minimal interaction. Exercise occurred in enclosed individual yards. Contact with other inmates was restricted. State officials maintained that this system was necessary to prevent organized gang violence inside general population units. Critics argued that indefinite isolation, sometimes lasting decades, caused serious psychological harm. In 2011, prisoners across California, including those at Corcoran, began a coordinated hunger strike to protest long-term solitary confinement policies. The strike expanded in 2013 and drew international attention. Human rights organizations, legal advocates, and academic researchers criticized California's SHU policies. The state did not deny the existence of long-term isolation. Instead, officials argued that gang activity posed an ongoing threat and that segregation was a security tool. The conflict eventually moved into the courts. The Ashker Settlement and its consequences. In 2012, a class-action lawsuit known publicly as Ashker v. Brown challenged California's use of indefinite solitary confinement for alleged gang affiliation. The plaintiffs argued that prolonged isolation violated the Eighth Amendment and denied due process protections. The case proceeded in federal court. In 2015, California reached a settlement agreement that fundamentally changed its policies. Under the settlement, indefinite solitary confinement based solely on gang validation was largely ended. A new step-down program was implemented to transition inmates out of isolation. Thousands of inmates were reviewed for release from SHU housing. For Corcoran, the impact was significant. The prison had been structured around long-term isolation management. Its SHU population declined as inmates were transferred or reclassified. Housing units designed for indefinite segregation became less central to the state's correctional strategy. The settlement did not eliminate violence in prisons. It did not end gang activity, but it altered the structure of high-security incarceration in California. And that shift reduced the operational necessity of institutions like Corcoran. Realignment and population decline. In 2011, California enacted public safety realignment under Assembly Bill 109. This policy shifted responsibility for many nonviolent, non-serious, and non-sexual offenders from state prisons to county jails. The goal was compliance with a federal court order requiring the state to reduce overcrowding. Before realignment, California's prison population had peaked at over 170,000 inmates. Within several years, that number declined substantially. Facilities built during the expansion era of the 1980s and 1990s were no longer filled to capacity. Operating costs per inmate rose as fixed infrastructure remained but populations fell. State budget analyses began identifying prisons for potential closure. Corcoran, with its aging infrastructure and controversial legacy, became a candidate. The announcement of closure. In 2023, California confirmed plans to close the original California State Prison, Corcoran facility. The decision was part of a broader strategy to consolidate operations amid declining prison populations. It is important to clarify, the closure did not mean that all correctional operations in Corcoran ended immediately. Certain facilities and housing units were phased out, while other correctional infrastructure in the region remained active during transition. Inmates housed in the closing units were transferred to other institutions within the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation System. Staff were reassigned or relocated. No public report cited a single violent incident as the cause of closure. Instead, the official reasoning centered on population decline, cost efficiency, long-term infrastructure planning, system-wide reform. The prison that once symbolized maximum security expansion was no longer essential to the system's structure. The human cost. Statistics explain policy, but they do not capture experience. Former inmates have publicly described life inside Corcoran's SHU as isolating and psychologically taxing. Some correctional officers have described working conditions as high stress and dangerous. Academic research on long-term solitary confinement suggests increased risks of anxiety, depression, and other mental health consequences. However, it is equally documented that prison gangs were, and remain, organized and capable of violence inside correctional settings. The debate over security versus human rights did not begin at Corcoran, but Corcoran became one of its most visible battlegrounds. Its closure does not resolve that debate. It only marks a chapter's end. Was justice served? Some observers believe the federal investigations of the 1990s exposed serious misconduct. Others argue that correctional officers were unfairly targeted for performing dangerous work under extreme pressure. Court verdicts reflected legal nuance rather than sweeping condemnation. The Ashker settlement reflected negotiated reform rather than a definitive judicial ruling on the constitutionality of every SHU placement. In other words, there was no single moment of reckoning. No dramatic final judgment that defined Corcoran's legacy. Instead, there were investigations, policy changes, budget decisions, and eventually, closure. What remains? Corcoran once represented California's response to violent crime during an era of expansion and fear. Its design prioritized control, separation, and containment. As sentencing laws evolved, prison populations declined, and solitary confinement policies changed, the institution's central function diminished. Today it stands as a case study, a reminder of how correctional policy shifts over time. A reminder that prisons are not permanent solutions, but reflections of political, legal, and social priorities. And perhaps most importantly, a reminder that behind every policy decision are real people. Inmates, officers, families, communities. The story of California's so-called deadliest prison is not just about violence. It is about change, and the consequences of how systems respond to crime. Voices from inside. For years, most of what the public knew about California State Prison Corcoran came from court filings, investigative journalism, and official statements. But during and after the legal challenges to California's solitary confinement system, incarcerated individuals began publishing written accounts, affidavits, and declarations describing life inside the security housing unit. These statements became part of court records and advocacy reports. Many described extreme isolation. Inmates in SHU housing typically spent approximately 22 to 24 hours per day inside a small concrete cell. Exercise often took place alone in a cement enclosure sometimes described as a dog-run style yard, an individual outdoor pen surrounded by high walls and fencing. Personal contact was limited. Phone access was restricted. Visits were often non-contact, separated by glass. Some incarcerated individuals reported that the uncertainty of indefinite placement was more psychologically distressing than the physical conditions themselves. It is important to note that accounts vary. Some inmates stated that segregation reduced their exposure to violence in general population. Others described it as psychologically damaging. What is verifiable is this: long-term solitary confinement at Corcoran and other California prisons became central evidence in federal litigation challenging the system. And those first-hand accounts influenced public perception. Psychological research on isolation. Academic research on long-term solitary confinement predates Corcoran. Studies from correctional systems across the United States have documented associations between extended isolation and increased rates of anxiety, depression, insomnia, hallucinations, and cognitive disturbances. Researchers caution that not every individual experiences the same psychological response. Pre-existing mental health conditions, duration of isolation, and environmental factors all matter. California officials historically argued that SHU placement was based on security classification, not punitive intent. The state maintained that gang leadership structures posed serious risks inside general population units. The conflict between security management and mental health consequences became central to policy reform discussions. The 2015 settlement in Ashker v. Brown did not categorically ban solitary confinement. Instead, It restricted indefinite SHU placement based solely on gang validation and created structured review processes. The policy shift reflected growing recognition, nationally, that prolonged isolation required clearer limits and oversight. The national context. Corcoran's story unfolded alongside a broader national debate about solitary confinement. In the early 2000s, several states began reassessing long-term isolation practices. Federal prisons also faced scrutiny over the use of special housing units and administrative segregation. In 2016, the U.S. Department of Justice issued a report recommending limitations on solitary confinement within federal facilities, particularly for juveniles and individuals with serious mental illness. Some states reduced their segregated housing populations. Others implemented step-down programs. Not all reforms were uniform. Correctional systems vary widely across the country. But by the mid-2010s, the era of widespread indefinite isolation faced increasing legal and political pressure. Corcoran had once symbolized the expansion of high-security segregation. By the time of its closure announcement, that model was being re-examined nationwide. The economics of contraction. As prison populations declined in California, the economic reality became difficult to ignore. Maximum security facilities require intensive staffing ratios. Specialized housing units, including SHUs, demand additional monitoring and security resources. Operating under capacity increases per inmate costs. California's Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation began publicly identifying facilities for deactivation or closure based on age of infrastructure, maintenance costs, population projections, geographic consolidation. Corcoran, opened in 1988, was not among the oldest prisons in the state, but it was built for a high-security model that had evolved. Reports indicated that closing selected facilities could save the state hundreds of millions of dollars over several years. These decisions were framed as fiscal planning rather than symbolic gestures. The state did not describe the closure as a moral judgment on Corcoran's history. It described it as a structural necessity within a shrinking system. Correctional officers and community impact. Prisons are not isolated institutions. They anchor local economies. The town of Corcoran has long been economically connected to correctional employment. When closure plans were announced, state officials stated that staff would be reassigned to other facilities where possible. However, any consolidation raises concerns about commuting distance, job security, and local economic ripple effects. Correctional officers working in high-security environments often describe their profession as physically and psychologically demanding. The federal investigations of the 1990s placed some staff under intense scrutiny. Years later, closure discussions created a different kind of uncertainty, this time about employment stability. Public records show that labor organizations representing correctional officers have historically engaged in debates over prison closures and staffing reductions. The closure of Corcoran was not only a policy shift, it was a community shift. The question of violence after reform. One central question remains: did reforms reduce violence? Data on prison violence is complex. Some reports indicate that overall prison populations declined without proportional increases in institutional violence. Other data suggest that gang structures remain active inside correctional settings, though strategies for management have evolved. California implemented new classification systems, intelligence monitoring methods, and step-down programs following SHU reforms. Publicly available data does not show a simple before and after narrative. Violence in correctional facilities depends on numerous variables: population density, staffing levels, gang dynamics, contraband flow, and administrative practices. What is clear is that the state concluded it could manage its current population without maintaining every maximum security institution built during the expansion era. Corcoran was one of the facilities deemed no longer necessary at previous capacity levels. Closure as policy, not erasure. Shutting down a prison does not erase its history. Records remain. Court documents remain. Memories remain. Corcoran's legacy includes documented fatal yard shootings, a federal civil rights investigation, a national debate over solitary confinement, major legal reform through settlement, and ultimately, consolidation within a shrinking prison system. It is tempting to frame closure as an ending. In reality, it is a transition. California continues to operate high-security institutions. Solitary confinement, while modified, still exists under regulated conditions. The broader criminal justice debate continues. Corcoran's shutdown reflects shifting priorities, not the disappearance of incarceration. What California's deadliest prison teaches us: Corcoran was built during an era defined by punitive expansion. It operated during years marked by gang violence and institutional controversy. It became a symbol, fairly or unfairly, of lethal force inside prison walls. And decades later, it closed because the system that created it changed. Not overnight. Not without conflict. But gradually, through litigation, legislation, budget analysis, and population decline. The story is not about a single incident. It is about structural evolution. Prisons reflect policy. When policy shifts, institutions follow. Corcoran's closure stands as evidence of that reality. What remains on the grounds? When California announced the closure of the original California State Prison, Corcoran facility, it did not mean the immediate demolition of the complex. Prison closures typically involve phased deactivation. Housing units are emptied. Utilities are reduced. Staff assignments are reassigned. Inmates are transferred in stages to other institutions within the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation System. Publicly available state briefings confirmed that incarcerated individuals housed in the deactivated units were relocated to other facilities based on security classification and available bed space. The physical infrastructure, reinforced concrete housing units, guard towers, perimeter fencing, does not disappear overnight. Prisons are complex state assets. In many closures across the country, facilities remain in warm shutdown status for a period of time. That means utilities and structural integrity are maintained in case the state needs the capacity again. Whether every portion of Corcoran will be permanently retired or repurposed remains subject to long-term state planning decisions. As of the most recent public information, no official announcement has indicated a demolition timeline. What remains is a structure built for a specific era, now largely inactive in its original form. Could it reopen? Reopening a closed prison is legally and administratively possible, but politically complex. California's current incarceration trend shows a significant decline from its mid-2000s peak. Multiple factors contribute to that decline: sentencing reform, realignment policies, voter initiatives modifying certain criminal penalties, expanded parole eligibility in some cases. State population projections have, in recent years, anticipated continued lower incarceration levels compared to the peak decades. However, corrections policy can shift with legislative changes. If prison populations were to rise significantly, maintaining preserved infrastructure could provide flexibility. As of publicly available data, there has been no formal indication that Corcoran is slated for reactivation. Instead, state planning documents have focused on consolidation and long-term cost management. In other words, reopening is technically possible, but it is not currently part of publicly stated plans. The evolution of high-security incarceration. Corcoran was designed during a period when physical separation and long-term isolation were central management strategies. Modern correctional policy in California still includes high-security housing, but the structure has evolved. Gang validation procedures have been modified. Review processes have been formalized. Step-down programs aim to transition inmates from segregated housing into general population under monitored conditions. Technology has also expanded. Surveillance systems, intelligence monitoring, and communication tracking now play a larger role in gang management strategies. This does not eliminate violence. It does not eliminate risk. But it reflects a shift from purely isolation-based control toward layered security measures. Corcoran's design, concrete-heavy, segregation-focused, reflected the logic of its time. The current system operates differently. How history will remember Corcoran. Public memory of Corcoran is shaped by documented events. The yard shootings of the 1990s, the federal civil rights investigation, the national debate over solitary confinement, the Ashker settlement, the closure announcement decades later. It is important to emphasize, there is no official ranking declaring Corcoran the deadliest prison in California. The label emerged from media coverage and the documented number of fatal yard shootings during a concentrated period. Its reputation was built on specific verifiable controversies, not a formal statistical designation. For some observers, Corcoran represents institutional failure. For others, it represents a difficult chapter in managing violent prison gang activity. History tends to record both. The broader correctional future in California. California's correctional future remains a subject of legislative debate. The state continues to face questions about sentencing reform, mental health services within prisons, reentry programs, Staff recruitment and retention. Infrastructure modernization. Recent years have shown a willingness to close facilities when population data supports consolidation. Whether that trend continues depends on crime rates, legislative priorities, budget allocations, and voter initiatives. Correctional systems are not static. They respond to public policy. Corcoran's closure reflects one phase in that ongoing evolution. Final reflection. California State Prison, Corcoran opened in 1988 during a period of rapid expansion. It housed some of the state's highest security inmates. It became the focus of federal civil rights investigations after documented fatal yard shootings. It played a central role in national debates over solitary confinement. And in 2023, it was confirmed for closure as part of population decline and system consolidation. No single event shut it down. No dramatic moment ended its operation. Instead, the same forces that built it, policy decisions, political climate, sentencing laws, eventually reshaped the need for it. That is the fully documented story. Not myth, not exaggeration, but institutional change over time. On Life Behind Bars, we examine prisons not as symbols, but as systems shaped by law, economics, and human consequence. If you found this investigation valuable, like this video and subscribe to Life Behind Bars. Your support allows us to continue producing long-form, fully factual documentaries about the realities inside correctional institutions. This has been Why They Shut Down California's Deadliest Prison. And the story, as always, is larger than the walls themselves. Corcoran was built for control. It became known for controversy. And in the end, it closed not with chaos, but with policy change. Prisons reflect the era that creates them. When that era shifts, even the most feared institutions can fall silent. Thanks for watching Life Behind Bars.